and inclusive places. I'm Jacinda Barbahan, a board member from the Congress of New Urbanism in New England, and I'm going to introduce you to our host in a minute, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a heads up and information about our organization in general. Oh boy, my slide's not moving now. Oh my gosh. There we go. Congress of New Urbanism is a national organization, and New England has a five-state regional entity that we're a part of. And as an organization, we're a group of designers, planners, policymakers, developers, and activists that work together to build places that people love through citizenry-based participation and planning. In our professional lives, we put together research, policy, and design to create sustainable places that are equitable for all. As an organization, we provide events and programming that connect our shared community and further our collective learning and goals. These are some of the major events that we hold annually. Like to thank everyone, all of our sponsors today that has made today possible and all of our programming possible. And then a little bit of housekeeping just to get going. Please keep your mic on mute. When we get to the question and answer session, you can have your choice of typing into the chat and try to get as many of those questions as possible, or you can raise your hand if you want to just ask a question the old-fashioned way. And for the main event, building inclusive, equitable and inclusive places, we're really excited today to have Frances Goyes with us as our panel moderator. She'll introduce the whole concept and I'll introduce her. Frances is an urban planner and designer. She currently is a policy innovation associate at MassHousing, where she works with the MassHousing executive leadership team to generate and evaluate policies and programs that advance affordable housing in Massachusetts. Her work includes research and implementation of strategies to narrow the racial home ownership gap, support neighborhood stabilization, and assist communities to plan for and build housing that is affordable. Prior to joining MassHousing, Frances worked as a housing and land use planner at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council and as a housing analyst at the World Bank. She's worked on community development and urban design projects in Mexico, Ecuador, Guyana, Colombia, Jordan, Indonesia, and the United States. Please welcome Frances. Thank you thank you for joining us.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jacinda. And I am here with the amazing group of people whose photos and names you can see on the screen now. We have a variety of planning firms represented that have all put together some amazing projects that we're really excited to talk about, both for their design, but also with how they build equitable and inclusive places at a very special time between the COVID pandemic and a renewed cause for racial reckoning. It is, I think, more important than in a while to think about building equitable and inclusive places. So to start us off, we'll have Jeremy Lake with Union Studio to talk about his regional work in creating equitable and inclusive places. So we'll have about 4 minutes for his presentation, and then please, anybody that's here with us today, feel free to ask any questions about his specific presentation. We have a nice and small group today, so don't be shy and ask away if you have anything. With that, Jeremy, I leave it to you.
Great, thank you so much. Can you guys see my screen okay?
Yep.
Perfect. So I'm Jeremy Lake. I'm a senior associate at Union Studio Architecture and Community Design, and I'm here to talk to you about our Community Resiliency by Design project. This was a project we did with the Cape Cod Commission. It really started before we got involved with them having updated their regional policy plan. They identified that housing affordability and choice is one of the most significant challenges on the Cape. There's a number of factors that contribute to this, but you can see here with these percentages in the middle, 62% of the national housing stock is detached single-family homes. In Massachusetts, that number is more like 52% across the board in the state. But on the Cape, 82% of housing is single-family detached homes. So not a lot of variety in the types of housing options that are out there, which doesn't support that many different sorts of lifestyles. It also creates an affordability challenge. At the bottom, you can see the dark blue is the affordable home price. The orange is the median home price. The darker bars are the 2015 numbers. The lighter bars are the 2025 projected numbers. So the affordability gap is increasing at dramatic rates out on the Cape, which not unlike other places in the US at the moment. So we were asked to come out and begin some community conversations around meeting the increasing demand for housing on the Cape, but to do so with community input to make sure whatever we were proposing felt right as far as the community was concerned. We worked with 5 separate communities, although we talked about it with a number of other folks as well. In each community, they identified a focus area. These weren't intended to be things that we were promoting just anywhere within these neighborhoods or communities, but really in these specific focus areas where they thought increased density might be appropriate. So again, we had 2 meetings with each of those communities individually. We also talked about it at the One Cape Summit and the Cape Housing Institute a number of times. So really had a broad audience of folks that we talked to about these issues out on the Cape. And the real core of the conversation was this notion that density can take many forms. And so when we talk about increased density, if you think of it just on a numerical basis, both of these examples are 20 units to the acre. On the left is what most people think that looks like, which is some sort of consolidated, condensed, large multifamily building. But really, you can distribute that in ways that are more appropriate to a given context. So on the right, that's actually a project of ours, Cottages on Green, but we're the same number of units on the same amount of land, but in a very different form, in a form that was much more acceptable for the local community. So on the Cape with these communities, we introduced this notion of missing middle housing, which to say all these various building typologies that exist somewhere between a single family detached home, which is like faded on the left, and a multifamily building, which is faded on the right. And historically, we had all these things at our disposal, but most of the zoning codes after World War II really sort of pushed these things to the side. Everything was either a lower density single family or a higher density multifamily. But there's a lot of great options and tools here at our disposal. So in each of these communities, we would go through and find local examples, and we would start our communal conversations, not giving them the words you see here, but just the 2 images, and asking them which has a higher density, and trying to tease out the fact that in a lot of ways, the forms might look quite similar, but the resulting densities could actually be quite different because it's a factor of how large the units are within that structure, how big the lot is. There's a lot of factors that go into the numerical density, but it's really the form that's the most important thing. I'm trying to find something that's contextually appropriate. So we would share with them a number of examples that were from their own communities. So again, limited examples of these sorts of things out on the Cape where we found them. We would document them and share them to make them realize this wasn't a foreign concept we were bringing in. These are things that do exist on the Cape. And we would conclude each meeting with going through the couple of options we had talked through and said, in the specific focus area we're talking about, could any of these be appropriate? And we would get some really great feedback from folks in attendance on what they thought. Because not everybody can come out to a town meeting, we also had a visual preference survey we put out and got several hundred more responses about. And because with a visual preference survey, you don't have the time to talk them through the specifics of the issue, we really boiled down the visual preference survey to the issues of style and scale. And so what we introduced were a number of images on the left that slotted or transitioned from a more traditional look all the way to a more contemporary look, and showed that at a single family scale, a townhouse scale, and a multifamily scale. Did the same thing in terms of scale, which is say for a single family house going from a 1-story to 1.5 to 2 to 2.5. And we would show these in a random order and ask folks to weigh in. Do you think this would be appropriate in the study area we're talking about? What was really interesting was we used these same sets of images for all 5 communities we worked in. So not only could we get a good gauge of what they felt was appropriate for their community, but we could actually cross-compare between different communities what might feel more appropriate for one place versus the other, because this isn't a one-size-fits-all question, right? So our final product was really to actually propose a number of prototypes within each community. So these varied depending on which focus area we're looking at, sometimes getting up to the scale of the walk-ups in the lower right. There were other times we showed things like accessory dwelling units as being a potential solution, but developing these models as a way of showing what could be possible. And to move quickly through the last little bit, for each we would do some plan diagrams, some illustrative examples of what those could look like. And lastly, we would actually plug them into a few sites or locations within those communities to show them how, depending how you deploy those things, you could get anywhere from 10 to 20 units per acre. You could use them as an infill strategy. It doesn't always have to be a new community, but really just reinforcing that if you were to stick with your typical single family zoning, you might only get 60 units, whereas utilizing a range of these types, you might get many times more of that, which would be the best way of solving that challenge on the plate. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. I guess 5 minutes goes by much faster when you're
So
looking at
fast.
something. It takes so long. So just out of curiosity, what would the next step be in this process now that they have a vision? What's next?
Yeah, this was all just meant to tee up, kind of taking away the worries that a community might have about increased density. So really it was now on the individual communities that were considering zoning changes, or I skipped over at the end, we talked a little bit about form-based codes and what those look like. Those might be a useful tool, since at the end of the day, form is really the issue, not the numerical density. So this was all a community outreach program really meant to tee up, hopefully easing future conversations that those towns were going to have with their local constituents.
That is exciting. Well, I look forward to hearing what those conversations look like. Planning takes such a long time, but there's a light at the end of the tunnel, but I feel like you have to sort of drag them and yourself there to get to the light sometimes. But thank you so much, Jeremy. And up next, we'll have Will with Utile to look at, and I think, yeah, to look at a vision for Haverhill.
Haverhill. Yes. Hi, everyone. So also, you may notice the small budding new urbanist about with me, so I'll try to have him not be too loud while I'm presenting. Utile completed this plan just before the pandemic hit. It's a citywide plan for Haverhill, Massachusetts, which is right on the border of New Hampshire, near Lawrence. Exactly. And the real key of it was that we really framed the master plan to be about future visioned framed as scenarios for the city, right? Which meant that the conversation was centered around growth, development, what you get and what you have to give up, and sort of that idea of the trade-off as a fundamental component of the project. And specifically, it was around this idea of industry, right? You know, we like to make these maps, these graphs, and you always see that healthcare and education are the biggest sectors in most American cities, right? You have a lot of nurses, you have a lot of teachers. That's pretty standard. And then the third one's always a question. And in this case, manufacturing, a robust manufacturing sector in a Massachusetts city is a special thing. And so that became really the crux of the project. So one of the big pieces was to really try to, via zoning, via design guidelines, take the already robust industrial manufacturing legacy of the city of Haverhill and grow it. So find new places for industrial parks. That, we used other typologies that we've been working on as a practice for a couple of years now, whether it's, in Alewife in Cambridge or here in the Marine Industrial Park in Boston, the idea of having newly designed ground floor high bay industrial space with room for office above using type 2A construction, so it had a lower price point and could actually pencil out. We then looked at the areas of Haverhill and tried to find sort of a more suburban style version of how to do that. You've got big and small parcels, and really it's the classic story, right? You've got already lots of parking and one-story industrial on the ground floor. If we were to change the height limits and reduce the parking requirements to line up with modern day, job requirements and parking requirements, you can fit up to 3 stories of office with newly developed, modernized industrial on the ground floor. You can configure it lots of different ways. It works for truck access and turning radii. And so that sort of is a center for new job growth. Along with that, the city's been working for many, many years with Mass Development and many other organizations to do revitalization of the downtown. And we really said that the master plan needs to continue that. There's an old deck that's falling apart. Use a process to dispose of city-owned parcels to redevelop the deck and do a lot of density. And that is happening as we speak. RFP went out, bids are being received. There's a very good chance that major development will be coming to Haverhill via this project, which is nice to see. And then finally, the last piece is about housing. There's some vacant sites along the Merrimack River, but then, we didn't fully settle on exactly how that should go, but it was a citywide conversation about the different kinds of levels of density, not unlike what we just saw from Union Studio. The idea is that you can, even at what feels like lower density, get substantially higher density than a single family in Haverhill. And so along with that, along the waterfront, finding parts along sort of little clusters within the downtown-ish part of Haverhill, trying to create the idea of village centers, right? Taking existing, Dunkin' Donuts and nail salon intersections that are kind of vestigial, and then dramatically upscaling that. I mean, not near what it is downtown, but creating the center for what could be a walkable kind of place where there's a corner shop and a store, that kind of thing. So the nice part is, all of this is, that happened. The pandemic hit, that things took a bit of a hold, but all of these zoning changes are implemented. They are now in the new zoning code, 100% there. And parcels along the river and the waterfront are being actively RFP'd out, disposed of, and developed. And so this has been a really reassuring time to see that when the city is a good partner and wants to see the changes happen, the work that we can do as planners on the community process can have, momentum as the project continues. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen.
That was really impressive, under 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Will. That was impressive, especially with a tiny planner trying to chime in too. No, I think that it's a really interesting time right now, especially considering the pandemic and renewed interest in manufacturing and sort of this shift away from offices towards more industrial and medical uses. So I think that it'll be a prime time opportunity for a plan like yours.
Yeah, and the last thing that I'll just say on that note is, we are seeing that exact issue that you just brought up in the city of Boston with work that we're doing there. Everyone is grappling with that in a huge way. And so our goal is to take otherwise slow city government process and shake them a little bit to wake them up and this is a major time to think about what you want to do. I mean, I don't mean it in the Rahm Emanuel never let a crisis go to waste way. That feels remarkably transactional, but in a different way, it's a moment to think about what we want to be. And so at least Haverhill, they're doing it. And so we want other cities to do that too.
Yes, hear, hear. Thank you so much, Will. Up next, we'll have Kathleen with Goody Clancy, centering more now on a TOD district. And yes, Kathleen, take it away.
Great, yeah, and so this was a project we did for downtown Danbury, adopted at the beginning of 2018. And I think we're gonna walk through some works we did in both this downtown and TOD plan, but also to pick up on some themes that our previous two panelists have said, just the importance of that planning process in terms of setting up engagement for implementation, and really then setting the stage where projects could still move forward in the pandemic, even as some of these ideas were also dealing with challenges. So I think for us, when we came to begin the downtown Danbury and TOD plan, it was very focused on their commuter rail station, very focused on a sort of traditional New England downtown. And then when we really looked at the sort of business mix downtown and also the sort of demographic trends that were really going to shape the future of downtown Danbury and be the market filling TOD housing, it was just really important to emphasize that 1 out of 3 residents in Danbury at that point, and I'm sure these numbers are going to be even more updated when we get to go from the 2015 ACS estimate to our new 2020 census numbers, were our Latinx. And that's also not just in terms of proportion of the population, is also the vast majority of population growth in Danbury. And so we knew that was something that needed to be a really important part of our planning process, but also our planning goals. And I think, the point below is something that was also really important in bridging that engagement, was making sure that, as we were talking about this issue, that we were really making sure to put it in context of the history of Danbury's downtown and a real history of immigration and diversity being part of the downtown area and what the future of redevelopment in the area could be. So when we laid out a vision for downtown, yes, we were sort of focused on the train station and thinking about how transit services could go together, but we were also really focused about how we thought about downtown as a possible diverse neighborhood and how that could really drive the core goals of what we love about downtowns as centers of community and really destinations for commerce. So what that meant when we structured this plan is, again, in addition to sort of specific recommendations on land use and development, on public space investments and core infrastructure, that we elevated the sort of theme of diversity and cohesion to be of a sort of equal importance in the framework of the plan. And so then, really tried to make sure that that was being put forward at the front and center of both our recommendations, study concepts, but also engagement. And it was something that we got a lot of enthusiasm. It brought in some new voices to the engagement process. Sort of to go back to one of this, like something we heard pretty clearly is people like really wanted there to not be another Steely Dan cover band on like Friday concert series, that a greater sort of variety of music would definitely drive more folks there. But I think another, really important component of this was just the importance of the immigrant business community to downtown retail in the area. And something that's been really successful during the pandemic is how, a public-private partnership and a emerging downtown management organization have used facade grants and support for outdoor dining to really help sort of support those existing businesses, and then developed a program for a downtown dining passport where you would have to sort of go try out like each across the sort of range of cuisines that there are in Danbury to eat. And I will say, as practitioners, we're all quite lucky when we get to work in places like Danbury where you'd really get to enjoy their towns. And another place where this implementation has really showed up is in ongoing sort of public space and public art planning that's been able to continue, both pre-pandemic, but also post-pandemic, as they look at, a property that we'd identified for redevelopment and how that could include a mural honoring a, long-term Danburyan, Mary Ann Anderson. And back to that sort of point of really bridging a sort of conception of our New England downtown as historic, as traditional, and how the aspects of what's historic and traditional about our downtown are these concepts of diversity and cohesion, and can really bring that forward together. And so that's, how we really tried to make sure that really carried through, all of those recommendations. I think some of those are likely to be more successful as we, think 10 years out about downtown plan implementation. And I'm sure it will also need to be something that continues to evolve. But it was a good challenge for us in thinking about a physical downtown plan of how to really try and elevate some of the issues of cultural planning and participation in addition to engagement.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kathleen. And I just realized one of those restaurants is Ecuadorian, and I'm from Ecuador, and there are rarely Ecuadorian restaurants around, so I'm so excited to go there. I also think what's really interesting about your plan is that a lot of it is in lighting up and making these spaces for people. And I think one interesting thing during the pandemic has been this renewed call, right, for open spaces, for more tables outside and dining and activities. So I imagine that maybe some of the things you had in mind got implemented maybe quicker than you thought they would, just because of this.
Yeah, no, I think it's been really exciting to see how they were sort of really struggling with outdoor dining and to have that kind of pivot 180. So that's always exciting to see when something can be really accelerated by a process.
Right. Maybe not through the best means, but it's still amazing changes. Awesome. Up next, we'll have Russell from Principal Group telling us about their plan for Washington Street in Newton in Massachusetts. So Russell, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Francis. Hi, everyone. We were thrilled to work with the mayor Mayor Fuller and the city of Newton, and then the city council and the whole community along Washington Street really covered 3 of their village centers. It was this was done prior to COVID, so I think a lot of the stuff I'm going to show you today is really about how you bring a community together to co-create a plan. And this is a really long stretch of city street adjacent to the Mass Pike, over 2.5 miles of sort of corridor. And you can see the kind of village centers there at the intersections, and really 2 commuter rail stops. And it was really looking, the mayor was looking at how can they sort of bridge the gap between the north and the south side of Newton, and really use this as a place where the city could grow an economic base and kind of convert some of the more auto-oriented land uses to more people-friendly or human-centric sort of development. And really that whole idea evolved throughout the process of how can this section of this corridor really become a better part of Newton. A lot of people had opinions about this. This was the sort of kickoff meeting we had, and we typically, when we're planning places and really working with a community, try to bring them together a number of times throughout the process, so we really have a collaborative, iterative approach to planning together. This is what it normally looks like now. Over the last year, we've pivoted all of our online engagement to a variety of digital platforms. But what I found, and there's hope here, I think, for everyone, is the meeting we had last night with the city council in Portsmouth, there was 14,000 hours of community input over the last 4 months. So I think that now that everyone understands how to use these tools, we actually are getting better engagement and better dialogue with the community. So in Newton, it was all about how do we bring this community together around discussing this corridor, a place that had not been planned and had extreme development pressure on it. A number of developers had already started to approve projects through their zoning process, and people recognized that there was a lot of tensions here. And that was clear. You could feel it in the room. But what we try to do is really discover with the community together using a host of activities and tactics to tease out what they understand their community to be and what they want their community to be in the future. And we make them draw, we make them write, we make them talk, and we make them talk to each other. And then we look at all that. We have to sort of bring all of that together. And what we find is if we do this properly, we start to have conversations and hear things that no one particular person in their community has heard before. We start to connect those dots. So then we'll go back to the studio and we'll start to try and understand those. And clearly tensions between these issues start to emerge, and we go back to the community with those and show them that. And one of the key ones along Washington Street was this visceral reaction to what I call dingbat development. This is just bad building. This is building parking structures that are disguised like housing. And we showed them why that's happening. When you actually deconstruct the development process here in Massachusetts, you realize that parking is driving all of our development. You do not get good buildings if you're trying to hide a parking structure. So we said, okay, well, there's another approach to that. Prior to the sort of focus on automobile storage, there was an incremental way to build our communities, and they subdivided those parcels into plots and into lots. Parking was in the basement, and you might end up in the same block. You have 12 buildings rather than 1 under conventional methods. But this is unrealistic. It has some issues around it with contemporary construction. So we said, okay, well, there's a way you could get a feel and a scale of architecture that is reminiscent of the community's sort of longing for a village center, but has contemporary housing requirements. So this was really looking at these types of courtyard buildings that were being built in other places and showing Newton how they could develop at an economic scale under sort of Boston construction costs and requirements, but create a sense of place that is actually more aligned with the kind of character and the aspirations around their community that they had, and bringing people together at a scale that was appropriate. So we did all this out in the open with everyone. We did this at a pop-up studio. We set up a temporary office. We brought people into that studio. We talked with them. We made them bring their kids. We set up temporary daycare so they could interact. We put the kids to work and let them do some planning. We served them all ice cream so that they were all in a good mood. And then we asked them more about the design and really iterated this with them over the course of all of these meetings and events. And a series of images emerged that was creating this corridor into a better place for Newton. and sort of bringing together the idea that there is land in their communities that could better serve the whole aspect of their community, from old, young, and every demographic approach. And then the idea of giving back from a social equity standpoint, the highway blew through these communities and really disrupted them. So thinking about repairing that scar by any means necessary, which was one of these ideas, was these pavilions that we would line up against the railroad tracks and the Mass Pike to really repair the southern side of Washington Street and create a full sort of corridor for folks. You can see an image of that there. And then again on the right here. And really this was all about the people. The people bring us all these ideas. It's just our method and approach. This is we listen and we really draw with them and create this plan together. And at the end, it creates a set of zoning documents that ideally delivers this vision to them. And one day, the parts of this Washington Street corridor will be better parts of their community. So thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Russell. I would love to see all those changes implemented. It's such a great area in its location near Boston, and its connections to other towns. I'll be interested to hear more about the community engagement process, especially how do you bring a diverse folks in the table, people that maybe don't live there but work there, and thinking a little bit more about that. But I think we'll have to move along quickly so that we can get into the questions. So up next, we'll have Natalie from Lifecare Design to talk about Parkville Market.
Hi, everyone. Yes, we did the Parkville Market. It is a building, located in between a transit-oriented development area, TOD, and a Parkville Historic Industrial District. As you can see, the blue outline is the historic district, and it practically matches the TOD. The TOD is because of this fast track bus station that we have just about like 100 feet away. And that connects Hartford to several other small towns, I think all the way into Meriden. The idea here was to not develop an 8-foot tower, which the owner perfectly well could have done because of the TOD. It's an area that wants more density. But because of all of the other industrial buildings that had been converted into loft units, there was a significant amount of new residents that have come in over the last 10, 15 years to warrant something different here. And being somewhat of a preservationist, the owner decided that the best thing to do, as well as we did, was to do this market. Here you can see Google took this picture under construction when it was just getting its Tyvek wrapping. So here is an early rendering of the whole campus, because he does own the other buildings and has future plans. So the middle building is the market hall. It was the storage depot for Capital Lumber, and the railroad line is right behind. And so there was an existing railroad line that pulled right into the building and loaded up with lumber and then came back out. Unfortunately, we couldn't keep it. We tried to keep that, but we had to put in a lot of concrete subflooring to make the building more rigid to accept the mezzanine level. So that had to go, unfortunately. We had some great ideas with that rail line, but as far as community, the spaces in between the building for us were just as important as the building itself. The reason why we are able to have this courtyard is because we allowed the traffic to wrap around the two buildings and come out this way as a one-way loop. They come in, they park in the back, and then they come out this way. So this space in between became a great community center area where everybody in the neighborhood can see it and can partake in everything that's inside. So here's a few shots of the before building. Where you could see the garage doors. We kept the garage doors. Each bay is 10 by 20 feet on either side of the building. And then you have this great hall in the center. And then there's an additional building that fronts the Park Street. And then we transformed it into this. So here's the hall bit. Here you can see the 10 by 20 bays. Down below are the kitchens, and upstairs are, well, currently individual dining rooms. Later on, perhaps there'll be retail. Here's a picture of the kitchen. We used cedar paneling, indoor and outdoor, because it's what was there. They had wood paneling originally. We couldn't reuse it because it was in such bad condition. But it's also antimicrobial, so we thought it was a great use for inside as well. As you can see, the bays, one of the reasons for the success of the project during the pandemia, is because every bay we introduced a takeout window. We didn't know the pandemic was going to come, but we were able to open up in May anyway because people were able to walk up and take out their food when you couldn't dine inside. And then with the addition of the 2 terraces on either side, and then this central courtyard space, there was so much space for distancing that they were able to open up right in May when they finished. The Parkville Market has quickly in the past year become a great community resource. I think in next week they're going to have a job fair in there because the Great Hall lends itself to accepting events like that. But they also have music, and we've made it pet friendly, kid friendly, and there's outdoor and indoor games. It's fully accessible off of the street because one of the main objectives is to make it have easy access from the fast track to walk right up in here. Yeah, and I think that's about it.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Natalie. And I love the projects showed in this panel because there's such a mixture of different both designs and locations, but also different levels of realization. You know, I think from an actual market that's been built and operated through COVID to the large scale community visioning process that's ongoing. So I think now we can just move towards a more open discussion. Natalie, I don't know if you need to unshare your screen.
Oh, okay.
Well, it's nice to look at the project.
Stop share. Okay, there we go.
Thank you. Awesome. So yeah, so we have a couple of questions thinking about the theme of equitable and inclusive places, right? And equity and inclusiveness is should be a part of every part of that design process, thinking both about the clients that you choose to work with, how you engage with people, you know, what is community engagement? Is it the folks that own and live in their homes and have been there for 50 plus years? How do you interact with folks that maybe work at the local grocery in town? How do you make sure to address any barriers of language or otherwise? And the final outcomes, right? How do you, through design, even though you can't control the end product so much, how do you think about and channel equity and inclusiveness? So I'd love to hear your thoughts. I will just start with Jeremy, but then anybody else can chime in. I just figured Jeremy, it's been a while since he said anything.
Just generally, how would we try to approach additional inclusive design?
Yeah, and I think especially through this project, you know, and
yeah, I think, you know, what was interesting about this project was it was a project that wasn't a project, right? I mean, there was no anything getting actually built. It was all sort of theoretical. And so we did our best to kind of reach out. We had public meetings, we had the visual preference survey, but I think, at least historically, I've noticed if you want people to come out in droves, propose something that they don't necessarily want to see, and then you get lots of people coming out, and that becomes your opportunity to try to educate and bring people along. And so I think, you know, and in these days too, you know, in a sort of post-COVID or still dealing with COVID sort of world, I think we've all had to embrace additional tools that have been great because they might reach out to additional people at times when they might not otherwise have thought of themselves as being available, or you know, try to get additional input as a result. So I think what'll be exciting is, you know, I think we're learning a lot of lessons through this process. I think I'm hopeful on the tail end of this thing, there'll be a lot of people that are looking for opportunities to get back out in their community and contribute in meaningful ways. So I think all of that kind of plays into it. And I wish we could have found more ways to get more people involved, but, at the time we did what we could. And like I said, when it was something as general as just talking about housing big picture, I think it attracted people that were interested in that as a broader topic, but we weren't able to get probably as many people as we wish would have been involved.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. Anyone else want to chime in with their thoughts here? Will.
I would say that, were our projects have happened now versus a few years ago when it did happen, I think we would have approached it a little bit differently. From a purely sort of pragmatic perspective, we didn't want to open too many major social issues to sort of lose direction with the project. So we didn't have a big conversation around the reckoning of the role of cities and creating equitable place. Like that didn't ever come up at all directly. Now that said, we used the built form as a proxy for a lot of those issues. I think, what our plan ultimately was very strongly supply side densification, YIMBY approach. And we didn't call it that, of course, because that sounds very ideological, but we called it, creating space for the next generation, or creating a better, mix of housing types to accommodate the major demographic trends facing our nation today, and by the behavior. And like a kid like this, I used myself as a personal example when I was going through these kinds of things. But if we were doing it nowadays, I think we would have to be much more direct, and which I think is a good thing. I think this is a major development in the field in the last couple of years. So I welcome it, because it means that I don't just look like I'm being provocative when we talk about these issues. In fact, it seems like it's an expected thing of all projects that we're doing now. So I don't know what that means exactly. I think this means that we have a lot more tense conversations ahead, but I'm glad it's changed for the better, very much.
Thank you, Will. And I don't know if Baby Planner agrees with you or not, but there are strong feelings there. Russell.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to reflect on the Washington Street project in the context of today. Newton is an interesting place with haves and have-nots, to say it in that regard. And there was a lot of very tense social issues that were below the surface during that process around I live in Newton, why do you want to have more housing in Newton, and the tensions around that. I think had we gone through that, similar to what Will just said now, I think there would have been some more meaningful discussions about that, rather than some very it was just, there were tense times during that discussion because people were not speaking what they were really feeling, and on both sides, and I think what we try to do is really get people through a process where they can actually start to collaborate together. And I think if there are those tensions at a very, and it don't necessarily have to do with anything with planning, or they have everything to do with planning, because they, if you look back to the history of parts of that, of our cities, you realize that, we're responsible for this. So in certain aspects of it. So I think as a planner right now, I'm at a lot of odds, because I see how people struggle to get through the day. And then we want to engage them in a discussion around how we can make their neighborhoods better. And they can't even make the time to come to a planning meeting, and we want to include them in that planning meeting. So I think we're at a real crossroads here of trying to understand, how do we do inclusive planning if the people we want to include don't have time to do the planning for the places that we are planning. So it's a real tension I see, and having to adapt our approach to things to virtually. I think we've been trying to break down some of those barriers, and we hold meetings in multiple languages. We have call in, we have people deliver plans to people who don't have computers. We do street teams where we're out there trying to interact with people, and you mentioned the sort of grocery store. We were out on a street team the other Saturday talking to someone, I think we just have to engage at a whole different level, rather than having a planning meeting in a high school gym on a Thursday night at 7 o'clock. That just doesn't work anymore.
I guess I also think we really have to think about how we think about outcomes, or how we're thinking about inclusivity in our recommendations or our projects, not just our process. and how we as practitioners can try and push that, right? I actually think that's a place where we as practitioners have a role in trying to really advance that or introduce new ideas. Because I think to the point you were raising, Russell, is it's like a lot of work to participate in a planning meeting, particularly if you're new to the process. And it also can be really unpleasant to like have to be the person who's carrying a perspective that your community, other members of your community don't embrace or feel threatened by. So I think like I'm starting to try and make sure we're really focused on thinking about how we would evaluate the inclusivity of our recommendations, or how we like judge the implementation of our plans long-term based on this is being really important. And I also think that sometimes we as consultants, we always present a plan, a project that like, it's really important for us to think about how we help support staff in terms of building sort of long-term relationships and coalitions around these issues. So, we do a lot of work with sort of working groups and stakeholder committees, and we're kind of deliberately trying to decenter us as sort of consultants being really important, because that's how those relationships exist in the long term to really carry forward implementation. So paradoxically, less about actually trying to get a lot of people to the public meeting sometimes, and more about really building a group of implementers who sort of trust and will work with each other.
I think what Kathleen's just brought up is actually really important, is building social capital in places that actually can move projects forward. Because I think that we've adapted a lot of our methods to actually create that. That's the thing we think we're leaving behind rather than a plan. I could care less about the document. It's about, are there people there that are going to be able to move it ahead? And a lot of times it can't fall squarely on the shoulders of staff, but needs to have a group of people who are aligned with that vision to move it forward. I think that's just so key right now.
Here. Yes, I know that CHAPA, at least here in Massachusetts, the Citizens Housing and Planning Association, have done some fantastic work putting together like TO drinks. So put folks that are interested and want to support, for example, TOD initiatives in their town, or like housing groups, and folks that can be advocates in the long term, right? Because as easy as a consultant, you go in, you do your part, and then you have to then disengage. You can't be there forever. And like Russell said, it's so key for something to not just sit in a shelf forever after it's done, but really drive that implementation. Another question I had, and it's, some of you have already answered this, but there's been two crises, one that's been brewing for centuries, and another one that was just took us all off guard. But how through the racial reckoning that is ongoing and brutal, and the COVID-19 crisis, not just for the project that you just engaged in, but in general through your work, how have these crises impacted your perception of inclusive design, and what are you changing in your practices as you move forward?
I mean, I don't want to jump in, but we actually are trying to develop a way of planning with communities now that is entirely focused on the youth. And if you're above 18 years old, you can't participate. And really trying to focus on the high schools, the middle schools, and across the demographic and socioeconomic spectrum. And we haven't really been able to do this with the community yet, but we're really interested in it. We've been doing some youth workshops, and we've been doing some engagement with, because we're always asked, oh, let's get the kids involved. And I think there's actually an opportunity to really address some of these issues at that younger age group. And what I find when we do have an opportunity to engage the youth in a process, they're totally honest about what's wrong in a place, and their ideas for how to fix it are amazing. So I think there's a lot of this baggage and a lot of these issues and a lot of these planning strifes that I think we're trying to get around by just going to the people who are going to tell us the truth right away, which is the young people.
I like very much agree with Russell on this, even as I've aged into like being considered an old person when engaging with young people, which was a rough age transition. And you know, speaking on the sort of aging point, I noticed in the chat that folks asked about the issue of aging and accessibility, and I think that's a really great point, and honestly, a tactic that, you know, we're really trying to make part of a lot of planning, particularly in some of these more suburban downtowns, like a plan we did in Fairfield, Connecticut. That's one of the real benefits that new construction offers that community. So we actually sort of looked at similar, as they were looking at changes to their inclusionary sort of zoning ordinance and bonuses, if we had a bonus that actually went with providing more than minimum number of accessible units, was sort of a concept that made it into that plan, because I think your point is well taken, that it's something we all, particularly in New England, really need to be thinking about and planning for.
Actually, you know, that point's interesting. I wanted to ask Jeremy about the inclusiveness around aging in place and how that came up with the missing middle housing, because there was a disconnect in the Washington Street process, because a lot of people are asking, you know, my son, daughter can't move back to Newton. I can't afford to age out of my single family home and stay in the community and move into an apartment. The housing wasn't there. And I said, well, you know what? That's a problem with your zoning, because you don't have any missing middle housing. And there was just a total disconnect between that idea of the wrong type of housing and not being able to age in place.
Yeah, no, a huge issue on the Cape, just like you described it, at both ends of the spectrum. Younger folks can't afford housing, so they can't move to the Cape or stay on the Cape. And you have older folks who are ready to move out of the single family home they've got, but there are zero options or opportunities for them, or very limited options, I should say. And so they find themselves having to decide, do I keep this big single family house that is too much for me, or do I move off the Cape? But the Cape's all I've ever known. And so what was interesting is we kept talking to the community about these issues. You began to realize it hits at every life stage. Like, it was important at every life stage. We tried to reinforce those issues, but it is a challenge. It was a primary challenge. And a lot of the folks we had coming out were retired folks to these kinds of sessions. And I can't afford to move out of my house. And that's a real problem.
What I would just very quickly add is, you know, the thing which I found which has the most success, and I'm hoping he stays next. The thing I found that has the most success and resonates the best has been to basically make that, it's something which I think I briefly alluded to, but I stick it in every citywide plan that I work on now. It's like a small quote from Alex Krieger's new book, City on a Hill, that talks, and it's like, you know, the housing stock in American cities was built, you know, 60 years ago, and it was for when, you know, the majority of families in America were 2 kids and maybe a dog, and so you had to have a single family home, and that now represents, or you know, like a third or a quarter of the American population, right? And that shift is happening, and it's already happened, and it will continue to happen. And so, you know, the idea of smaller, dense units in whatever form you want to describe them as, the visualizing density examples that you guys gave are very useful. Like, that is helpful both to young people trying to move into, like, enter the world of home ownership, as well as like freeing up the single family homes for everyone who wants, like, it solves all, it's the thing which we don't have, right? And that's a very clear story that makes sense to people. Now, what's interesting, what I'm curious to see how it changes is, like, you know, a week or two ago, there was like an op-ed in the Times that was saying that, you know, single family zoning is basically the modern day redlining, right? So this is becoming a conversation in the public discourse. That's a particularly provocative way to talk about it, but what I appreciate is that it means that when we're bringing up these ideas of getting away from single family zoning, it doesn't just sound like a bunch of CNU people from South Florida talking about whatever their ideas are. Like, it's actually right at the heart of something which is part of a nationwide conversation. And so hopefully that means it sticks in a way that's a little bit more resonant than has been the case before, I hope.
Thank you so much. Natalie, any thoughts?
Well, actually, I mean, the idea of the market that we had, we made sure that whatever it is we did, it would be appealing to older people as well as younger people, and part of the marketing of it also, you know, emphasize that it's not just the building, you know, we're the architect, but there's a marketing team that went out of their way to make sure that there's something for everybody there, and that everybody should feel comfortable coming in there. We went out of our way in the design to make sure every little part of it was handicap accessible. I see there's a note there for ADA, so that people who are aged or young people, or who are unfortunately wheel bound, chair bound, that they could move around very easily in the whole place. So yeah, I think from the planning stage all the way down to the actual physical presence of the spaces, it should be accommodating just about everybody. Well, at least this place, because it's it's open to the public.
Here, thank you. There's another question in the chat about a circular neighborhood. So a circular neighborhood is an ecosystem in which services like energy, water, mobility, and waste are shared. Resources circulate at their highest value, and daily life is within walking distance. Were these ideas part of your plans that you presented?
We had our water company involved, the MDC, for several months. But I mean, they have their own system. It's very thorough. It's a very costly system for all of our residents because it takes care of Hartford and the surrounding towns. So no, there's nothing really circular about it, but no, they were definitely involved. Much to whether we liked it or not, they were involved.
Awesome.
I think that issue of the sort of district level utility systems and all, it comes up a lot in some of our work, and there's a huge issue and disconnect between the utility providers and actually, I think, delivering those circular systems that are at a block or a neighborhood level. So I think that's a whole nother lecture, kind of roundtable discussion we can have on that. But I think it comes up a lot in the sort of sustainability work, but I think there's a lot more innovation needed on that.
Thank you. And I have one last question, and it can be quick. But part of building equitable and inclusive places is having equitable and inclusive design companies making these things, right? Because, for example, I'm an immigrant, I'm a female, and I'm Latina. So obviously the way I think about housing is, okay, we need a house that can house both my mommy and my little brother and our families, which is maybe different than the perception somebody else has from a different culture. So how are your companies internally thinking about inclusivity and equity?
I can answer that a little bit. This has been something that Utile has been thinking about a lot over the last year. It's a company that was 25 people when I first joined and is now pushing 70 something. So just opening a new office, like a lot of new people coming on. And traditionally for a long time, it's drawn from Boston area universities. And for all the diversity and equity issues that are from that labor pool, there's sort of that requires some expansion. And it means that you can't just go to a couple open houses and hire the people you like. And it's required, actually, in a weird way, a company growing up a little bit and having formal application processes that are out, that are publicized and sent to lots of places, and creating partnerships with historically Black colleges and other architecture programs. And it's been really hard. I mean, it's been good, I think. But it's required, I would say, sustained leadership from the management of the firm, as well as a director of equity and inclusion that we hire. It's required massive attention at all levels of the company to try to make it happen. And even then, with all the effort, it's still a slow process because you only hire so many people as you hire. And so I'm glad we're all doing it, but what I find amazing is that with all that effort, it's still at the bottom level of what should be acceptable for the change happening. And so my main takeaway is it's really hard.
And I will bet I know a bunch of people, probably including myself, are getting ready to hop on late to their 1 o'clock meeting. But in addition to everything Will said, I think one opportunity of the pandemic for us has been sort of better ability to survey kind of all levels of the company anonymously. And so get a little bit more honest feedback from particularly sort of junior level staff in terms of sort of what's working or what they're concerned about in terms of how we operate as a firm. So I think that's always a good reminder that as much as we think about structuring engagement processes externally on our projects and how those are inclusive, that we have to sort of be the same level of mindful sometimes about our own internal structures. Thanks, everybody.
Can I chime in for 1 second on that front? I was actually at a MassHousing forum that Francis helped with last week, and heard that a really good tip in that regard, and that not only is the recruitment important, but the retention is an important part of it. And that a good way to ensure retention is to hire in cohorts, not one-offs, so that people don't feel isolated. And you can start to build more communities within your organizations that way. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Sorry to make you a little bit late. But yes, looking forward to hearing more about these plans and discussions in days, weeks, years to come.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye, everyone.
Bye.